Hello, my name's Thomas Thompson and I'm the Chief Executive of CPRE Peak District in South Yorkshire. I'd just like to introduce this film in which Jean Smart tells of her career with the charity and also the history of the charity back to 1924 by saying that we're tremendously grateful for Jean for taking the time to do this. Ordinarily, Jean would help us in travelling around the Peak District in South Yorkshire and giving this talk to a variety of clubs and organisations and audiences, but unfortunately we live in times when that's not possible to do that. So we're tremendously grateful for Jean for doing this, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.
I want to tell you about Ethel Haythornthwaite, an extraordinary Sheffield woman who pioneered countryside protection and town and country planning, not only in this area, but nationally. And I will outline just a few of her many achievements. Ethel was a reserved, self-effacing person, but she had a steely determination and a genius for influencing and persuading. I worked for Ethel and the man who was later to become her husband, Gerald Haythornthwaite, for 37 years at the Sheffield and Peak District branch of the Council for the Protection of Rural England. And it was a privilege and an education. Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in the wonderful city of Sheffield are able to enjoy the countryside very easily. The Peak District National Park and the Sheffield Green Belt are close by, where we can be in touch with nature in every season of the year. However, this did not come about by chance. We have a great deal to thank Ethel Haythornthwaite for, as I hope you will agree by the end of this talk. This is Miss Ethel Mary Bassett Ward, who was born on the 18th of January 1894. She was the daughter of the Sheffield businessman Thomas W. Ward and Mary Sophia Ward, née Bassett. Thomas W. Ward was born in 1853 and was a self-made man, a multimillionaire in today's terms, who started work at the age of 15 as a coal merchant, but moved into the steel industry and became a skilled shipbreaker and tradesman. One of his many large transactions was the purchase of the scrap of the burnt remains of the Crystal Palace. It was said that at one time he owned enough ships to furnish the needs of a small nation. Perhaps some of you will remember his works called Albion Works, which he had on Savile Street in Sheffield. All this and his many other business interests made him a very rich man. This is his portrait wearing the regalia of Master Cutler of the city of Sheffield in 1913. And this one is his wife, Mary Sophia Ward. He was already successful when he met and married Mary Sophia Bassett of the Sheffield Bassett Sweet Company. Thomas W. Ward was a Methodist and drew around him like-minded people with largesse and social consciences, such as the Sheffield benefactor Alderman J.G. Graves. Ethel was born at the family home in Millhouses Lane. At the turn of the century, her father, in accordance with his increasing wealth and status in the town, had a large mansion built on Endcliffe Vale Road, which he called Endcliffe Vale House. This house was eventually to play an important part in the beginnings of Ethel's work in Sheffield. This is Endcliffe Vale House in 1910. Ethel had three brothers, Leonard, Frank and Alan, A.B. Ward, who founded the Sheffield bookshops, which are now Waterstones, and a sister, Gertrude, 2 years younger than her. This shows Ethel and Gertrude with their brothers at the door of Endcliffe Vale House. I am told the car is a 1906 Talbot. Ethel and Gertrude were to be lifelong companions. These photos here of Ethel in 1910 and Gertrude were taken in the grounds of Endcliffe House. And this one here with their horses, and the next one here in 1909 we have Ethel and Gertrude with their mother and of course chauffeur out for a picnic in this amazing automobile. When they were about 12 years old, they were sent to the exclusive West Heath School in London. Ethel excelled at English and literature and Gertrude at music. From West Heath, Ethel went on to London University to read English. Gertrude returned home to Sheffield to study the piano and to help to run the large family household. This was a great relief to Ethel as she had absolutely no interest in domesticity. She had enjoyed the countryside and the hills from childhood. Her education and love of literature led her to study the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge and Blake in particular, and she began to visit the Lake District, and this reinforced her love of the mountain country. After university, Ethel returned home to Endcliffe House. The horrors of the First World War were looming. However, in 1913, their mother took Ethel and Gertrude to Paris. Ethel wrote an extensive diary of this visit that she prefaced with the words, "Impressions of a fortnight in France, written in a thundering hurry and in bad style by Ethel M.B. Ward at the age of 19, April to June 1913, private, absolutely and completely." She added, "So, I am now Ethel Mary Bassett Ward before Paris. I shall then be her ladyship after." This seems to indicate that she was contemplating marriage to Henry Burroughs Gallimore. Harry, as he was known, was 9 years her senior and a graduate of King's College, Cambridge, and was a noted scholar. His father owned a Sheffield cutlery company, Gallimore and Son. Ethel, Gertrude and Sophia Ward returned home to Sheffield, but Ethel and Harry did not marry until 1916. At the outbreak of war, Harry had gained a commission in the Royal Field Artillery, and very shortly after their wedding and honeymoon in the Lake District, Harry went to France with his regiment. Sadly, he did not return. He was killed in an explosion on the field of battle on the 26th of May, 1917, at the age of 31. He is buried in the Royal Artillery Company Cemetery near Calais. So, at the age of 22, Ethel was a widow. She was truly heartbroken by her loss. Her brothers, her sister Gertrude, and parents all did their best to care for her, but Ethel became very ill. Her family were desperate to find something to distract and to interest her and enable her to move forward with her life. It was thought that the countryside and the hills, which they knew she loved, might solve the problem, and she was encouraged to start to visit the countryside again with other members of her family. And here is Ethel on one of those visits. She noticed many small developments taking place in these precious places that she considered were inappropriate, badly designed, or just in the wrong place. In particular, she disliked the many advertising hoardings lining the country roads, and ugly and badly sited petrol stations were beginning to appear in isolated country lanes. And there was litter around. In the 1920s, a lot of unsympathetically designed houses and bungalows were beginning to be built in the Peak District villages. She called these cuckoo's eggs and realised that there should be some controls over planning and design, especially in sensitive country areas. These photos show typical examples. Here is a petrol station in Bamford in the 1930s, and an ugly hoarding in Hope, and ribbon development on the edge of Sheffield. Of course, the control of development has not always been subject to planning permission by the local authorities. Planning legislation, as we know it today, really only began with the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947. Before that time, if you could afford to build, the local authority had very limited powers to stop you. And if they did, they had to pay you compensation. So you can imagine that this rarely happened. Ethel was concerned that as the years went by, these accretions of inappropriate developments would spoil the lovely areas of the Peak District and the villages of South Yorkshire. She wanted England to be a home for the heroes and heroines of the First World War to return to be the Jerusalem of which William Blake had written. Ethel slowly recovered and began to have a purpose to her life once more. She decided to dedicate herself to the protection of the countryside of Sheffield and the Peak District. She knew she had to formalise her work and to draw together as many other like-minded people as possible. This is where her contacts with the great and the good of Sheffield were to be of assistance to her. On the 7th of May 1924, a small select gathering of 12 men and women met at Endcliffe House. They discussed the formation of a society for the preservation of local scenery. The founder members present were a cross-section of the leading citizens of Sheffield. The Honorary Secretary elected at the first meeting was, of course, Mrs. Ethel Gallimore. She was now 30 years old and her lifelong work was just about to begin. It was decided to call the new society the Sheffield Association for the Protection of Local Scenery. However, just 2 years later, when the Council for the Preservation of Rural England was being formed in London, Ethel accepted their invitation to become the CPRE's representative in the Peak District. The society was therefore known after 1926 as the Sheffield and Peak District branch of the CPRE. The officers for the society were to be in her home, Endcliffe House. Ethel immediately devised a strategy the society was to continue to employ for many years to come, gathering credible evidence, persuading, lobbying, crucially finding acceptable alternatives to unsuitable proposals, influencing public opinion, and often using her own funds to purchase land which was under threat in order to remove it from the development process. Among several other properties, she purchased Cowclose Farm in Hathersage, and in EDALE, she purchased Upper Booth Farm, both of which are in lovely locations in order to secure their protection. She knew from the start that the only way forward was to persuade, lobby and educate public opinion, and vitally lawmakers. The 1920s were of course a time of considerable change. car ownership was beginning, and amenities which were previously available only in towns were spreading to the countryside. Piped water supplies, electricity, and telephones. All these had an effect on the countryside and the rural scene. However, Ethel and her society did not want to deny anyone these improvements to their lives, but they did want to ensure that necessary developments were done sympathetically and with some thought given to the rural surroundings. One of Ethel's earliest efforts was in trying to prevent litter. She contacted the Sheffield Bus Company, asking them to put receptacles for used tickets at the exit of the bus. She had found that people would get off the bus at Longshore and drop their tickets, which would then blow all over the estate. The bus company agreed, and after that, all Sheffield buses were fitted with ticket receptacles. It was an early example of her persuasive powers. And here is Ethel at her Save the Countryside exhibition in 1929. She knew she had to get her message across to as wide an audience as possible, and it was decided to hold the first of several exhibitions she was to organise in the coming years. In 1929, she mounted her iconic Save the Countryside exhibition in the Cutler's Hall. Alongside were lectures by leading academics, and over 4,000 people attended. She produced a series of panels showing before and after, the beautiful and the ugly, the well-designed and the badly designed. The Sheffield Telegraph said it was impressed with the way the exhibition had been devised, which showed not only how things were being done wrong, but how they could be done right. The work then mushroomed to such an extent that it was essential, if the momentum was to be maintained, that she have assistance. Ethel, her brother Alan, and sister Gertrude decided to pay jointly the salaries of a technical assistant and a secretary. Interested members of the public were joining CPRE, and their modest subscriptions of 5 shillings per year were also used to fund the work. The threat to the peak, wasting no time and building on the success of the 1929 exhibition, Ethel's ceaseless campaigning continued with the production of the book, The Threat to the Peak. 90 years on, the threat to the peak still has relevance today. It was of large format and excellent design, expertly written by Ethel, and illustrated with beautiful black and white photographs by her technical assistant, Phil Barnes. Its message is compelling, and the tone is set in the foreword by Professor G.M. Trevelyan. He wrote, "This book is a work of counsel and exhortation, a humble petition and advice to the inhabitants, visitors, owners, and public bodies in whose hands the fate of the Peak District lies. The tide of public opinion is moving with great rapidity in the direction of a new demand for the preservation of natural beauty. The young, on the average, feel it more keenly than the old. Outrages cheerfully perpetrated 20 years ago with nothing said will be impossible today. Outrages possible today will be impossible 20 years hence. The future is on our side in no small degree if we can hold the fort for another generation." This is followed by pictures of the changing landscapes of the peak from south to north, accompanied by pages of stunning photographs. There are then chapters that drive home the message on building styles and building materials, on intrusive advertising, litter, ribbon development, uncontrolled tipping, and so on. The book ends with the case for the necessity of town and country planning. And it makes you realise the breadth of issues she was facing, and also that most of these issues are just the same today. The Manchester Guardian commented that the photographs were the best photos we have ever seen of the Peak District country, and said it was an inspiring manual of defensive tactics. 4,000 copies of the book were distributed, with copies sent to every member of the House of Commons, the Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, and to the Prince of Wales. The Longshore Estate, much loved by Sheffield people. Just 3 years after the formation of her society, a huge challenge came Ethel's way, and this became the crowning achievement of the 1920s, and in my view of the whole history of Sheffield CPRE, the purchase of the Longshore Lodge and Estate from the Duke of Rutland. In 1927, the Duke of Rutland put up for sale 747 acres of the Longshore Estate, including high moorlands covering a further 10,800 acres, without any restrictions, in order to pay the costs of death duties. The land ran from Fox House and included Burbage and many farms, sheep grazings and meadows. Proposals for its use, suggested and detailed in the sale documents, included large detached homes at a cost of £499 each, a hotel and a golf course. However, as the Duke did not impose any restrictions and there were virtually no planning controls, anything could have happened there. Ethel knew immediately the land must be purchased in order to protect it. Fortunately, the local authorities decided to buy the high moorland for water catchment purposes. However, this left the shooting lodge and the Longshore Meadows and Estate, which was such a vital part of the Peak District scene and the most popular with Sheffield people. Ethel was at the helm of a campaign to purchase, with the assistance of Sheffield Corporation and a bank loan of £13,000, enable the property to be conveyed to the CPRE. We have to remember what a vast sum that was in 1927. It was a very brave thing to do. It was vital that money be raised to pay off the loan, and within 5 months, £9,000 had been raised, largely by gifts by members of the CPRE, again thanks to Ethel's good connections and powers of persuasion, and by public subscription and donation. The Ramblers Association, the Sheffield Council for Social Service, now called Voluntary Action, and the Sheffield Town Trustees made other generous donations, and the property was eventually conveyed from the CPRE to the National Trust at a ceremony at Longshore on the 25th of March 1931. It was the National Trust's first country property in the Peak District, and there it remains, and for perpetuity, one of the most popular places in the National Park. On obtaining the property, the National Trust formed a Longshore Management Committee, and Ethel was of course appointed its honorary secretary. How many of the thousands who visit Longshore each year know what might have been but for this public-spirited and determined Sheffield woman? It was an amazing achievement we should all be grateful for. Sheffield without Longshore is a sad thought. Another outstanding success was the permanent protection of Blackham Moor on the southwest of Sheffield in 1933. Norton Rural District Council were the authority for this area, and they had tried to protect it and its woodlands since 1929 by adopting a draft planning scheme. However, it was under pressure for building, and they could not afford to pay compensation to builders. Ethel turned to her father's friend, the Sheffield benefactor Alderman J.G. Graves. Ethel asked him to visit the moor and woodland with her. When he saw it, he said, "It's mine." The next day, Mr. Graves' solicitor telephoned Ethel to tell her that Alderman Graves was minded to purchase the land, which he duly did, and he gave it to Sheffield City Council for the recreation of its citizens in perpetuity. And this is a 1933 photograph of the handing over of the deeds to the Lord Mayor of Sheffield Corporation by Alderman Graves. After this ceremony, Mr. Graves said to Ethel, and I am quoting from her own notes, "Now we have done all this for you," by we he meant the Graves Trust, "will you promise never to trouble us again?" I took a deep breath, thought I had better be truthful, and said, "Whenever the countryside around Sheffield is in danger, I shall appeal to you." He looked at me severely, but not unkindly. "Well," he said, "now we know." In 1935, Ethel, still troubled by the ugliness of much of the new development she saw, had plans prepared for houses and bungalows which her society thought were suitable for the Peak District and could be built for under £500. This is one of the designs contained in the publication Small Houses and Bungalows Suitable for the Peak District, which was published by Ethel in 1936. I understand that several houses were built from the designs in this book. This is about the point when Ethel met the man who was to become her second husband, Gerald Haythornthwaite. He was born in Bolton on the 24th of July 1912 and was 18 years younger than her. He attended Bolton School and then studied architecture at Manchester University. Gerald completed his degree in June 1935 and went to work at the offices of an architectural practice. However, he was a person who wanted a cause rather than a career, and he was soon looking for something more to his taste. In November 1935, Ethel's assistant, Phil Barnes, had moved on to take charge of the Lancashire branch of the CPRE. So she advertised in the Times for a replacement. Gerald applied, and on the 25th of November, Ethel wrote asking him to attend an interview that took place a few days later. He told me that when he got off the train at the old Victoria station on that dark, wet December day and surveyed the scene over the wicker, the many worked chimneys belching smoke, the soot in the air, the clanging of the drop stamps in the steelworks, he almost got straight back on the train to Bolton. Ethel asked him, Will you tell me your age, please? If you took this place, would you be prepared to stay not less than 2 or 3 years? Gerald was offered the job and he reported for work at Endcliffe House on the 2nd of January 1936. However, the letter of appointment from Ethel contained one sentence that probably cooled his delight a little. I might say that the standard of lettering and draftsmanship, as shown in the drawings you left here, is not quite up to our usual standard. Ooh, ouch. So, Ethel is now 42 years old, has been a widow for 20 years, and into her life comes a young man of 23 who shares her need for a cause and her interest in the arts, literature, and love of the country. Gerald was possibly somewhat overawed by the status of his employer, both in terms of her place in Sheffield's academic world and her reputation as the founder of what was then a trailblazing society. They obviously got on well, as it seems the relationship soon became a romantic one, and they married at Sheffield Register Office in December 1937. They moved to the Peak District, but the CPRE's offices continued to be at Endcliffe House. They had a big job to do. In 1936, a speculative builder had purchased 84 acres on the north side of the Hathersage Road and an adjacent field of 9 acres opposite the Moor Inn at Worlow, and intended to build 900 houses, which would have ruined the rural approaches to the Peak District. Encouraged by the public support, they set about persuading Sheffield City Council to pay the builder compensation in order to prevent the development. This would have seemed to be an impossible task, but Ethel and Gerald nevertheless threw everything into achieving this aim. Again, Ethel's charm, tact, reputation, and formidable persuasive powers came to the fore. She began writing letters to the press and promised to raise the compensation money if necessary. She went to see the leader of the council, Alderman Fred Marshall, who later became Labour MP for Sheffield Brightside. And I am quoting from her notes on what she said to him. I said, I knew we could not save all the rural surroundings adjoining Sheffield, but I did hope we could save some of the specially favourite ones, such as Lodge Moor to Stanage or Worlow to Moor. He looked at me very steadfastly and said, we must save it all. I shall never forget how my heart leapt at these words, at the realisation we might have official backing for our ideals. A deputation from the branch went to the town hall to put its case to the Highways Committee. There was no planning committee at that time. They forcefully delivered their objections to the Worlow development, but also took the opportunity to tell the council that the time had come to fix some limit as to where the town should end and the countryside begin, and that the suburbs should not be allowed to spread to the edge of the moors as they were in grave danger of doing. In the event, the force of the CPRE's arguments were accepted by the City Council, and they paid the builder the sum of £22,000 in compensation in order to stop the development. A very large sum in 1937. This was another great landmark in the CPRE's history. The idea of a green belt for Sheffield had been firmly planted in the minds of the council. They certainly did not want to have to keep paying out huge sums in compensation in order to continue to protect Sheffield's famous golden frame. In September 1937, the City Council asked the CPRE to submit proposals in the form of a map as to areas on all sides of Sheffield that might suitably be preserved as a green or agricultural belt. So, the council were to get this onerous work done by Ethel and Gerald with the assistance of other amenity societies at no cost to the council. However, they were more than happy to do it. The whole of the rural fringes had to be visited, mapped, assessments made, and recommendations put forward. This is the map which they prepared and submitted to the City Council for consideration. The Sheffield Green Belt Plan, very largely based on the plan produced by the CPRE, was approved by the City Council on the 1st of June 1938. Another trailblazing victory for the CPRE and the determined work of Ethel and Gerald. However, the approval was only by a very small majority, and in view of this, they knew they had to maintain their vigilance. They did not rest. Buoyed by this great advance, they immediately turned their attention to developing the idea of a national park for the Peak District. There were no national parks in the UK at that time. Acceptance of the notion of national parks required a great deal of lobbying and persuading in many quarters. Even though another war was looking inevitable, Ethel and Gerald decided to press on with their work for a Peak District National Park, and they convened a meeting at the Church Hotel in EDALE on the 19th of November 1938. The platform party were Ethel, Gerald, a senior government advisor, Mr. John Dower, again Ethel's good connections being very useful, the secretary of the CPRE in London, and a delegate of the Manchester Ramblers Association. 42 representatives of other amenity societies attended. It was agreed at that meeting that the area of the Peak District National Park should be that shown by the dotted line on the map presented to the meeting, and that a committee to further the object of a national park for the Peak District be formed under the auspices of the Sheffield CPRE. Ethel was appointed honorary secretary of that committee. Here is the map they produced, and with only small alterations was in due course accepted by the government as the national park. So the last years of the 1930s were to be a time when their work was gaining strength and official backing. But unfortunately, it was also a time when everything had to stop, as war was declared. Gerald was already in the Territorial Army and was called up in August 1939. I'd like to quote from a letter Ethel wrote to Gerald on the 3rd of September 1939. Beloved, so we are in it. For I suppose even busy army officers are allowed to know that from 11:15 this morning, England was in a state of war with Germany. And here we all are with identity labels and gas masks. God knows what it means, but if God is on any side in the sin of war, we can humbly believe he is on ours this time. I think I feel better now than in the preceding days of suspense, but you are the poignant thing in my mind. How I wish you could be spared all this undeserved thing. Quite a controlled and measured response, I think. Imagine how she must have felt after her despair at losing Harry in the first war. The thought of this being repeated must have been terrible. Ethel moved back into the family home at Endcliffe House, but she did not consider shutting up shop. She was alone with the work for the next 4 years, and she continued her vigilance throughout. Gerald served in the War Office in London, in Algiers, and in Norway. He eventually became a lieutenant colonel and was thereafter referred to by one and all as the Colonel. And this is Gerald outside the War Office in London, and here on active service in Algiers. He returned to Sheffield and Ethel in 1945. Sheffield's town trees. Well, this was a hot topic for Ethel in 1945, when the city's trees were being pruned and lopped in a most unsatisfactory fashion, as you can see. In her 1946 annual report, Ethel referred to this as a holocaust, when graceful forest trees, perhaps Sheffield's only remaining beauty after the war, were reduced to mutilated stumps, regardless of their natural species or shape. More lopping followed, and public protests grew. Sheffield CPRE sprang into action and engaged an expert arboriculturist to inspect the city's trees and draw up a report. He concluded, in short, that trees had been lopped without regard to their species and often for no apparent reason. There seemed to be no hope for improvement until the corporation itself appointed its own expert. In the meantime, it was decided to raise awareness by the public and those in authority by issuing a leaflet written by Gerald entitled Town Trees, giving advice on how to care for trees correctly. 4,000 copies were distributed. The booklet was well reviewed in the press, and there were leading articles in the Manchester Guardian, the Sheffield Telegraph, and a column in the Observer. In May 1944, Ethel had produced the book, The Peak District, a National Park. The timing was perfect, and as with all her work, it was a brilliant piece of communication and lobbying. The book was addressed to all who love the Peak Country, and it put a compelling case for a national park for the Peak District. It was widely distributed and received a good press and aroused a lot of interest among MPs. The tide of opinion was going their way, and in 1947, the first Town and Country Planning Act reached the statute book. In 1945, the government had appointed a committee chaired by Sir Arthur Hobhouse, charged with making specific recommendations on national parks. Ethel was appointed to that committee. And here is Ethel, John Dower, and Sir Arthur Hobhouse on a site survey visit. Because of Ethel and Gerald's early work in having a proposed plan ready, the Peak District was designated the first national park in England in 1951. It is a testament to their professionalism that the plan they produced was accepted with only minor alterations as the national park. Importantly, because the Peak Park got in first, ahead of fierce competition from the Lake District, it got its own planning board in Bakewell. The Lake District followed later, and now there are 15 national parks throughout the UK. And here is Ethel addressing a Ramblers Association National Park Celebration Rally in Cavedale in 1951. The Standing Committee on National Parks was asked to draw two lists, A and B, in order of priority of persons recommended for non-political appointment to the Peak Park Planning Board. Ethel was number one on both lists. She was not appointed. After all those years of pioneering hard slog, it is inconceivable to me that she should have been passed over. She was a giant of the countryside movement. She was in every sense the perfect candidate. Could it be the reason she was not selected was because she was a woman? However, Gerald was appointed and ministers nominated member of the new board, and he remained so for the next 35 years. Dovedale. Gerald took this photograph in the 1960s, and he always showed it at his slide lectures. And I often saw the looks of total incredulity on the faces of the audience when he explained what had been proposed there. In 1955, just 4 years after the establishment of the new national park, Derbyshire County Council were among the first to give wholehearted support to an incredibly unsuitable scheme for its use. A consortium of the motor racing rally, of the motor racing lobby, seriously proposed building 200-mile-per-hour Grand Prix racing track in Dovedale, complete with bunkers, pits, car parking for up to 25,000 cars, grandstands and sewage disposal works. The proposed route comprised 4 miles of the Buxton to Ashbourne Road and the area westwards into the upper slopes of the Duff Valley, above Hartington, involving opening up the narrow lanes of Hangdale and Longdale. This proposal had the strong backing of the leader of Derbyshire County Council, Alderman Charles White. The establishment of this facility was approved in principle by the County Council on the 4th of May 1955. It is no exaggeration to say that there was shock throughout the country at these proposals. It was debated in the House of Lords, there was a leader in the Times against it, and it was discussed in the House of Commons. Ethel and Gerald threw all their energies into the defeat of this scheme. The fact that preparations for this had been taking place for over 2 years was a further cause of anger. In the face of this overwhelming opposition, Derbyshire County Council eventually said they had shelved the proposal. Alderman White said, "The scheme is dormant, not dead." Well, I hope by now it's well and truly deceased. And in order to show you how it might have been, this is Brands Hatch. Again, how many visitors to Dovedale know what its fate might have been without Ethel and Gerald Haythornthwaite? This is the last Executive Committee meeting to be held in Endcliffe Vale House. Ethel's father had died in 1926 and her mother in 1956. And as the war had changed the old order and they no longer had the number of staff necessary to run a household of the size of Endcliffe House. It was sold to the University of Sheffield, later demolished, and is now the site of the student village. Ethel and Gerald moved into number 22 Endcliffe Crescent, quite large Georgian house in the next road. I like this cartoon by Gerald, showing the last moments at Endcliffe House. You can see the removals men are inconvenienced by Gertrude, who won't leave the piano. Gerald is completing his yoga exercise, and Ethel is pulling out her hair after reading There Is to Be a Butlins Holiday Camp on Kinder Scout, while one of the staff tries to pour her a cup of tea. The old stable block behind number 22 Endcliffe Crescent was converted into offices for the CPRE. This is number 22 Endcliffe Crescent, and this is the converted stable block used as CPRE's offices, where I eventually worked. In 1963, I was 19, and I had been working as a shorthand typist at an engineering company. I saw an advertisement in the Star for someone to assist with interesting and varied work with regard to architecture and the countryside. I thought this sounded intriguing, and I applied and I got the job. When I first reported for work at number 22 Endcliffe Crescent, I thought I had stepped into a parallel universe. Even in 1963, their household was of another age. I had been happily brought up on a Sheffield Council estate, so you can guess I had never been anywhere, nor met any people quite like this. For instance, there was a vintage Rolls Royce in the garage, alongside a modern top-of-the-range car. There were 2 Steinway grand pianos in the house. One, which was beautifully inlaid, was a gift to Gertrude from her father. The other, a wedding gift from Ethel to Gerald. They had a living maid, a cook, always referred to as cook, plus a spare cook for weekends and holidays, 2 cleaning ladies and 2 gardeners, and an occasional handyman. Afternoon tea was served at 4 o'clock every day, complete with fine china and cook's excellent cakes. Dinner was at 7, and Ethel and Gertrude always dressed for dinner. I was sometimes asked to join them for afternoon tea, and I enjoyed it, as it gave me an opportunity to talk to them about things other than work. I was interested in literature, and both Ethel and Gerald encouraged me in this and introduced me to works I would otherwise have known nothing about. I am so grateful to them both for the free education I had whilst I worked alongside them. I also met many amazing people who were in their orbits. I really was very lucky. When I first met Ethel Haythornthwaite, I thought he looked like a part of the countryside. He habitually wore tweeds, +4s and jackets the colour of the Moors. He had the manners of an old-fashioned gentleman. For instance, if he was introduced to a lady, he would always bow and kiss her hand. Most ladies were quite surprised by this. The River Valley. With regard to the work, I was thrown immediately into a major campaign they were mounting to oppose the Sheffield City Council's plans to build 3,300 houses out from Malin Bridge, all along the Rivlin Valley up to Hollow Meadows. If this were allowed, it would not be long before housing ran right up to the National Park and beyond. I have to emphasise they did not want to deny anyone a home, and they always acknowledged the need for building. They proposed realistic alternatives, and their alternative to this was to develop Mosborough into a new township. In 1964, a long public inquiry was held in the Lomas Hall at Stannington, and the result went very largely the CPRE's way. Although some housing was permitted in Stannington, the minister at the time, Richard Crossman, said he was in no doubt that the Rivlin Valley should remain a permanent open space along the western approaches to the city. And fortunately, so it remains. As you will know, the Mosborough area was eventually developed into new townships. I learned a great deal from their meticulous work, careful preparation, and exhaustive research. They were totally professional in their approach, and they commanded the admiration and respect of government ministers, local authorities, planning professionals, the press, and even those they opposed. This photo of Ethel was taken in, I think, the late 1970s, and this of Gerald in 1994. And here, together in Ethel's office at number 22 Endcliffe Crescent in the 1980s. Their work received both local and national recognition. In 1947, Ethel was awarded an MBE, one of the first awards for countryside conservation in the voluntary sector. However, many people thought she deserved a higher award. In 1951, Sheffield University awarded her the honorary degree of Master of Arts. At the conferment ceremony, the public orator dubbed Ethel the sleepless guardian of the beauty of the countryside. How true that was. Gerald was similarly honoured by the university in 1963 and then appointed a CBE in 1980. In November 1994, a tree planting ceremony was held to commemorate Ethel and Gerald's achievements. The woodland was named the Haythornthwaite Wood, and it is opposite the Moor Inn at Worlow on the fields which the CPRE saved over 50 years before. And here is Gerald planting a tree at that ceremony. In 2000, an excellent book, Protecting the Beautiful Frame, by the Sheffield historian Professor Mel Jones, was published. This is a fascinating, detailed record of Ethel and Gerald's work and the achievements of Sheffield CPRE under their guidance. They continued their work up to the day of their deaths. Gerald worked in his office right up to the evening of the 4th of January 1995. A colleague and I found him lying on the floor of his kitchen when we arrived for work on the following morning. He had been carrying his breakfast tray, complete with his porridge and tea, which was lying scattered on the floor. On the dining table were the files he had been working on the previous day. He was 81. Ethel had predeceased him. She died at the age of 92 in April 1986. Her sister Gertrude, who was by her side her whole life, died in 1989 at the age of 94. Earlier, I referred to the entry that Ethel made at the beginning of the diary she wrote when she was 19 and visiting Paris with her mother and sister. At the very end of that diary, in June 1913, she wrote, "Dear old diary, I rejoice that you are finished, for you have been a damned worry and a dear delight. When I am 60, nay, before, I will look at you again, you that I wrote in my young learning years, in the flower of my hope, in the eagerness of my young heart. Dear woman, How has your life passed since you were 19? Did the great love you dreamt of ever come? Did you fulfill your life in the creative way that you hoped for? What are you? A noble, successful character or a broken-hearted soul? Neither perhaps, but are you an ordinary matron with 4 children, a whiskered husband, and an extraordinary interest in all household affairs? Oh no, never. Oh, help me, God. But by this time you will have found out the truth. Well, Ethel did find not one, but 2 great loves of her life, and she certainly fulfilled her life in a creative way. Out of her despair at the loss of her first husband came the great work of her life, which in turn brought her her second husband, love, and a partner for that work. To end, I would like to quote from just one of the many tributes that flowed following Gerald's death in 1995. The mountaineer Sir Chris Bonington wrote, "At the head of the Sheffield CPRE for so long, the tireless, single-minded and selfless Ethel and Gerald Haythornthwaite were without parallel. Ethel's ability to persuade and influence, and Gerald's grasp of technical detail over a wide area of disciplines made them formidable opponents and splendid allies. We shall not see the like of them again. They were of their time, and their creative partnership was unique." So, when you visit the Peak National Park or a quiet country area in South Yorkshire, please remember Ethel and her husband Gerald, who pioneered the protection of these areas and to whom we in Sheffield owe so much. Thank you.
Thanks again to Jean for taking the time to record that film. We're very, very grateful to her. If you visit the charity's website at cprepdsy.org.uk, you can find out the various ways of joining, volunteering or donating with the charity. We'd be exceptionally grateful for any support you can give us. Thank you very much.